Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is our second module in Physiology 1 course as part of continued education program. It's about motor nervous system. We will start by introduction to motor nervous system and to human reflexes. The objectives of this course, of this lecture, is to know the major component of the nervous system, to understand the concept of lower motor neurons and upper motor neurons, to identify types of body movements, and to define human reflexes, reflex arc, and to know the types of reflexes, to know what is meant by stretch reflex and what makes it unique. We should know about stretch reflex, reflex arc, functional anatomy of the muscle spindles. So we will start with major component of the motor nervous system. The major component of the major nervous system involve part which is central and part peripheral. So central nervous system, which has the cerebral hemispheres, cerebellum, brainstem, and spinal cord, and the peripheral division or peripheral nervous system participation. Actually, you can't separate the motor from the sensory nervous system. You can't put limits. For example, sensory nervous system help the promotion or the action or the function of the motor nervous system. For example, if you are crossing the street and you observe the car approaching you, so you observe this car by sensory stimulus from the eye, by vision, so it is sensation. And in response to this sensory stimulus, you will increase your steps or run if it is very close. So there is a close association in action between sensory division of the nervous system and motor division. For the motor component of the nervous system, of the peripheral nervous system, we have either somatic motor nervous system, in which motor nerves supply skeletal muscles, and we have visceral motor system, in which fibers affect smooth muscles and cardiac muscles. And here the fibers reach its target organ through sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So the major components of the motor nervous system are cerebral motor cortex, a very important center in the CNS called the thalamus. Sometimes we can call it neuronal relay station. It has a number of centers for both motor and sensory nervous system. We have basal nuclei or basal ganglia. We have the cerebellum. We have brainstem. As you can see, there is a networking and connections and relationships between all these centers. And from brainstem, there is interconnection in both directions between brainstem and spinal cord, and finally between spinal cord and skeletal muscle. So the connection between, or the interaction between spinal cord and skeletal muscle is two-way, or there is feedback from skeletal muscle to spinal cord. Again, the concept of relationship between sensory system and motor system, we cannot put a limit. For example, sensory input, like the cars that you observed coming toward your side when you are crossing the street. Sensory input transmitted from the retina to the central integrator, and from the central integrator to a motor areas from which the motor order will originate, and the order leaves the CNS and come out through the peripheral nervous system through motor fibers to skeletal muscle, which result in contraction of certain skeletal muscles, which are the effector. So the effectors are the skeletal muscles, and through the contraction of these effectors, or through the contraction of these muscles, we will have the effect, which is either running or increase the speed of your walking, and so on. So for levels of skeletal muscle control, it is different levels. We have higher centers In the cerebral cortex, we have a second level of integration represented by basal ganglia, cerebellum, thalamus, and brainstem. And then the third level, which in direct interaction with muscle fiber, this is either brainstem for cranial nerves or spinal cord for other spinal nerves. For brainstem and cranial nerves, the story is some muscles are controlled by cranial nerves. For example, muscle supplied by facial nerve, which is the seventh cranial nerve. In this case, the center of this cranial nerve is present in the brainstem. But for spinal nerves, the center or the cell body or the origin of the cell comes from the spinal cord. So spinal cord and brainstem for the last level, which come in direct contact with the muscle fiber or with direct contact with the effector. Now we have to be familiar with the concept of lower motor neurons and upper motor neurons. For upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons, very important clinical applications that we are going to see in the next lectures. If this is spinal cord and we have cut section in this spinal cord, you can see that the central part here is dark in color. This formed of gray matter and it's edge-shaped. This part or this gray matter has the nerve cell bodies. This is cell body, and the edge shape surrounded by white matter, which contains the nerve fibers. So here in the gray area there is cell bodies, and here in the white area there is nerve fibers or nerve tracts. In this white area you can see either motor or sensory tract ascending or descending between the spinal cord and the cerebral cortex. If there is, this is a skeletal muscle which represent my target in the next lectures, because in this lecture we are going to talk about somatic motor nervous system and not visceral motor nervous system. So in somatic nervous system, the target or the effector is skeletal muscle. From here, from the anterior, this edge-shaped gray matter in the cut section of the spinal cord, which contain nerve cells. Here the cells in the anterior part is called anterior horn cells, and these are the cells motor in function, has motor function, but cells in the posterior root are sensory cells. So what concerns me here in this module is these cells which lie in the anterior horn of the spinal cord and form anterior horn cell. So from anterior horn cells is the cell body, and then the axon of this cell comes out from the spinal cord through ventral root. It comes out and moves to the periphery. And as it approaches the skeletal muscle, it starts to divide into terminal branches. Each of these branches will supply muscle fibers. So it is efferent motor neuron and divide into terminals, and these terminals supply group of skeletal muscle fibers. And from here we should know a concept of motor unit. For each motor cell, or for each anterior horn cell, it divides into terminals that supply a number of fibers. So the this axon and the fibers it supplies called motor unit. You can see the number of these fibers varies according to the type of movement required. For example, if for a muscle that perform a fine movement like the hand muscles that we use for writing, the number of fibers per motor unit is few. But for muscles which perform gross movement like muscles of the back, the number of fibers is multiple. So the number of fibers per motor unit depend on the muscle, the type of muscle. Is it fine movement or it is coarse movement? Again, this is motor neuron in spinal cord, its axon, and now the terminals which supply a group of muscle fibers. These groups of muscle fibers innervated by single motor unit together with this motor unit form the this is innervated by single motor neuron. So these fibers together with the motor neuron it supplies form what is called motor unit. And lower motor neurons start from here, from the cell bodies in spinal cord, till reaching the effector or the muscle fiber. So the lower motor neurons from the cell bodies in the spinal cord or in the brainstem for cranial nerves together until reaching the muscle. So if we have any lesion at these levels or any injury at these levels, it's called lower motor neuron lesion. For example, there is a famous infection called poliomyelitis. Poliomyelitis, the virus attacks these cells or anterior horn cells. It is form or it is a type of lower motor neuron lesion. Another example, if there is trauma or accidents affect the ventral root of the spinal cord, so it is lower motor neuron lesion. Let's come to the periphery. If there is peripheral nerve injury, it is lower motor neuron lesion. And maybe in the muscle itself, like muscle diseases or myopathies, it is also lower motor neuron lesion. Within the anterior horn, there is another type of neurons in addition to alpha motor neurons, which supply the skeletal muscle fibers. We have another smaller neurons called the gamma motor neurons. So in the anterior horn cells, two types of neurons: alpha motor neurons and gamma motor neurons. The alpha motor neurons supply skeletal muscle fibers, supply the fresh part of the muscle. But for gamma motor neurons, it is smaller in size, present in less amount, about 30% of the total cells in the anterior horn cells, and then it supply specialized muscle fibers embedded within the fleshy part of the muscle. These specialized muscle fibers are called muscle spindles. So we have a fleshy part of the muscle, and within the fleshy part there is another structures or another receptors called the muscle spindles. And these muscle spindles innervated, the fibers of these muscle spindles are innervated by another type of neurons called gamma motor neurons. These structures are surrounded by capsule. This capsule, this in violet color, yes. And to differentiate the fibers of this structure from the fibers of the fleshy part of the muscle, we call the fibers inside the capsule intrafusal, because this capsule is fusiform in shape. So we call it intrafusal muscle fibers because it is present inside the fusiform capsule. And these muscle fibers, which form the fleshy part of the muscle, we call it extrafusal muscle fibers. So alpha motor neurons supply extrafusal muscle fibers, and the gamma motor neurons supply intrafusal muscle fibers. Nothing new in this slide. It is again the arrangement of the centers and the levels of innervation. So we have brainstem nuclei and spinal cord, from which the direct innervation arise and reach the muscle. And don't forget the interaction between sensory and the motor innervation. Actually, from the spinal cord or from the brainstem, where the cell body of the motor neuron comes out to reach the muscle fibers and form the motor unit. This is it is the final common bus. It is a site of modulation. It is a site of convergence of a number of informations from a number of higher centers. So anterior horn cells in the spinal cord or in the brainstem, the corresponding cells in the brainstem represent what is called final common bus, because it is a site of convergence of a number of information or a number of signals that comes from a different centers. For example, they receive information from primary motor cortex, they receive information from brainstem nuclei, they receive information from afferent neuron terminals. So this is a site of convergence of a number of information, and in turn a site of integration and the processing of this information to give the proper order to the muscle fiber. So this is upper motor neurons is the level above the spinal cord. So any neurons above the level of the anterior horn cell is supraspinal, is upper motor neuron. For example, neurons in the primary motor cortex are upper motor neurons. Neurons in the cerebellum are upper motor neurons. Basal ganglia are upper motor neurons. Thalamus, upper motor neurons. Brainstem, the supply spinal cord, are upper motor neurons. So the levels of upper motor neuron is any level above the level of the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. So if this is anterior horn cell of the spinal cord, this is from here till the muscle, it is all lower motor neurons. But any upper motor neuron or supraspinal center contain upper motor neuron. So cells that carry signals from the supraspinal centers to lower motor neurons of the spinal cord are the upper motor neurons, while upper motor neurons carry motor commands to lower motor neurons, which execute them by causing muscle contraction. So the three upper motor neuron busways, which give the order or innervate the lower motor neurons, one called corticospinal motor busway. Cortico because it originates from the cortex, spinal because it ends at the spinal cord. The second is brainstem busway called lateral brainstem busway, and the third is the medial brainstem busway. Actually, the arrangement of anterior horn cells in the spinal cord is different, has a spatial arrangement. So the anterior horn cells, which control proximal muscles, are present medially within the spinal cord, and the anterior horn cells, which supply distal muscles, are present laterally within the anterior horn cells. So there is spatial arrangement of anterior horn cells or spatial arrangement of lower motor neurons within the spinal cord. Once more, there is conversion of information or signals that convey or converge to the anterior horn cell in the spinal cord. For example, it receives input from upper motor neurons in the brain. It receives sensory input from the muscle, for example. It receives input from spinal cord interneurons. And then the function of this alpha motor neuron or anterior horn cell is to integrate all these information that reach to it to give the muscle the appropriate order. So this is the anterior horn cell or the lower motor neuron, and this is a number of informations from the higher centers and from the peripheral sensory input. Finally, after processing what it received from all these areas, it gives the appropriate order to the muscle or to the effector organ. Now we can consider the here this is a lower motor neuron or anterior horn cell, and this is conversions of different from different sources. and then it will process here and to give the main or the proper order to the muscle. Now we have to know what are the types of body movements. We have voluntary movement, we have reflex movement, and we have rhythmic movement. So voluntary movement, like you are performing something you want to do. You want to write, so you hold the pen and start writing. You want to drive, you want to hold the ball. I want to play piano, and so on. So voluntary movement, you are completely conscious of what you are doing, and you decided to do this action. You decided to perform this movement. Reflex movement occurs on subconscious level. You didn't think or decide when you performed it. For example, if your hand approached this candle because of pain sensation, you will rapidly withdraw your hand away from the nauseous stimulus. Third movement is called rhythmic movement. Actually, rhythmic movement has an element of initially it has a voluntary component, and then there is alternating contractions, like what occurs during walking and what occurs during mastication. Now we are going to define human reflexes and the concept of reflex arc and the types of reflexes that we can see. What's meant by reflex is a stereotypic response to specific stimulus. Stereotypic, it means it happens in the same pattern. The same muscles contract with the same pattern every time this stimulus is applied. So it is expected. It is stereotypic response due to certain stimulus. For example, if you touch some person with a pen brick, it will result in removal or withdrawal of the touched or withdrawal of the limb that is affected by the painful stimulus. If you repeat this stimulus or this insult with a number of people, you will have the same response. So it is stereotypic. It occurs in the same pattern. You will have the same response every time you apply the same stimulus. The reflex arc, it describes the circuit that underlies the reflex. What is the circuit which determines this reflex? So if we have a reflex arc, this reflex arc start with a receptor which detect the change in the environment, and these receptors transmit afferent fibers. These afferent fibers will pass to certain center, maybe one or more central neuron that integrate the response, and this response will pass from the center to the effector organ via efferent fibers. So the structure or the component of the reflex arc are receptors, afferent fiber, one or more centers, efferent fiber, and effector. Reflexes can be divided into central and peripheral. Peripheral reflexes are local axon reflexes and local enteric reflexes. For local axon reflexes, it is well explained with the cardiovascular system. It is apparent it is related to circulation, but not in the scope of this module of motor nervous system. And for local enteric reflexes, it is also not in this module of the scope of this module, but it can be explained more in lectures of GIT, for example. So now we are going to talk about central reflexes. Central reflexes, that means they have to be integrated within the central nervous system. So the site of integration is what make the difference between these two forms. If this reflex is integrated within the central nervous system, it is central reflex. If this reflex is not integrated within the central nervous system but integrated peripherally, so it is peripheral reflex. For central reflexes, we have conditioned or unconditioned reflexes. Conditioned reflexes are learned reflexes, and they need cerebral cortex to be formed. For example, if you learn that association, it's a sort of association between certain stimulus and the response. So the response will occur when certain stimulus occurs. It is learned reflexes. But unconditioned reflexes are not learned, they are inherited, and they are divided according which is the area in the central nervous system where integration will occur into hypothalamic reflexes, like those involved in thermoregulation, midbrain reflexes, medullary reflexes, and spinal reflexes. We will have these reflexes in our lecture. Spinal reflexes. So spinal reflexes are one of the central reflexes. They are integrated within the spinal cord. So spinal reflexes, according to the number of synapses between afferent and efferent fibers within the reflex arc, we are going to further classify spinal reflexes into monosynaptic or polysynaptic reflexes. So, according to the number of synapses within the reflex arc, according to the number of synapses between afferent fibers and efferent fibers, spinal reflexes will be classified into monosynapses if there is single synapse between afferent fiber or sensory neuron and the efferent fiber or the motor neuron. So synapse means area of contact between two neurons. So if there is only single synapse in this reflex arc, so it is monosynaptic reflex. And to be practical, we have only one monosynaptic reflex, which is stretch reflex. But if there is more than one synapse, there is synapse 1 and here is synapse 2. If there is more than one synapse, maybe 2, maybe more, within the reflex arc of certain spinal reflex, so it is called polysynaptic reflex. Now we are moving to stretch reflex, which is the only monosynaptic reflex in our body. So stretch reflex is the only monosynaptic reflex. Sometimes it is called the myotatic reflex. This reflex means that stretch of innervated muscle is followed by its reflex contraction. So the stimulus here is stretch of the muscle, and it must be innervated, otherwise the reflex arc will be interrupted. So stimulus is stretch, and the response is reflex contraction of the previously stretched muscle, provided that it is innervated. As you know, for any stretch reflex, for any reflex arc, it must start with receptor that detects the stimulus. And for stretch reflex, the receptors are the structures that is present within the fleshy part of the muscle. And we have it before when we were talking about the types of cells present in the anterior horn cell. So in between the fleshy part of the muscle fiber of the skeletal muscle, in between the skeletal muscle fibers, we have tiny structures called muscle spindles. This is muscle spindle. So muscle spindle is the receptor for stretch reflex. So muscle spindle is the receptor, and it is present in between and parallel to the fleshy part of the muscle. Because the structure of the muscle spindle, it is consists of small fibers surrounded by fusiform capsule. And to differentiate the fibers of the muscle spindle from the fibers of the fleshy part of skeletal muscle, we give it another name. For here, because this capsule is fusiform capsule, So we will name the fibers that is enclosed within this capsule intrafusal muscle fibers. So the structure of the muscle spindle is a group of intrafusal muscle fibers surrounded by fusiform capsule. And in this condition, we can call the muscle fibers of the fleshy part of the muscle by extrafusal muscle fibers. So what is present within the fusiform capsule is intrafusal muscle fiber. And what is present outside the fusiform capsule is the extrafusal muscle fibers. Muscle spindles, this is the receptors of the stretch reflex, which is the only monosynaptic reflex in our body. And this is the extrafusal muscle fibers. So for stretch reflex arc, you have to know what is the receptors, what is the afferent, what is the efferent, and what is the effector. As you can see, this is monosynaptic reflex. There is only one synapse within the reflex arc. So the stimulus for this reflex is stretch of the innervated muscle. And the receptors are muscle spindles. The afferent fiber is a sensory nerve fiber that innervate the receptors. So receptors, which are muscle spindles, transmit the information about muscle stretch to the CNS or to the spinal cord through sensory fiber. The center is the spinal cord or the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord. This is the center. And the efferent is the motor nerves that is going to innervate the skeletal muscle, which is previously stretched, and the effect of this signal is contraction of the muscle and having the effect. So the response is contraction of the muscle. So the reflex arc of stretch reflex, stimulus, stretch, receptor, muscle spindle, afferent, sensory nerve, center, anterior horn cell, and efferent, which is the motor nerve to the stretched muscle. You have to know the functional anatomy of muscle spindle. So this is muscle spindle, which form the receptor structure for stretch reflex, fusiform capsule, and within this fusiform capsule we have small fibers. Because it is enclosed within the fusiform capsule, it is called intrafusal fibers. And for the fibers which form the fleshy part of skeletal muscle, they are called extrafusal fibers. As we previously mentioned, we have two types of cells in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. One of them is alpha motor neuron, and it supplies the extrafusal muscle fibers or the fleshy part of the muscle, and the other is extrafusal muscle, and the other is gamma motor neuron, which supply the muscle spindles. So we have about 8 to 10 intrafusal muscle fibers per spindle, and they are arranged in parallel arrangement. They are arranged in a parallel form to the extrafusal muscle fibers or to the fleshy fibers of the muscle. But of course they are much smaller, very small in size and very small in diameter. Each intrafusal muscle fiber, each one of these fibers, let's focus on one of these, consists of central part and the peripheral parts. The central area is non-contractile area. It doesn't contract. It doesn't contain contractile proteins. But the peripheral parts are contractile. They contain the contractile proteins and they can contract. The central non-contractile part represents the sensory part of the muscle spindle, and it is innervated by sensory fiber. So this is the site of reception. Actually, this is the site which informs the spinal cord that there is a stretch in the muscle. But for the peripheral part, the peripheral contractile part, They are not contractile autonomously. They have to receive the order from the spinal cord through gamma motor neurons. So, contraction of the peripheral contractile parts of intrafusal muscle fibers occurs under the effect of gamma motor fibers. We have two types of intrafusal muscle fibers, depending on the morphology and depending on the function. We have nuclear bag fibers and we have nuclear chain fibers. So the nuclear bag fibers, you will find the central part dilated like this, in a central dilated part. And in the central dilated part, there is an accumulation of many nuclei. The nuclear chain fibers has no central dilatation and the nuclei are arranged as one row. Muscle spindle has two innervation. They send information and receive information from the CNS. So the connections between muscle spindle and CNS is two-way connection. They receive a motor order from the spinal cord through gamma motor neurons, and they send the spinal cord information about the state of muscle stretch. So they are innervated by afferent fibers or sensory fibers, and they also innervated by efferent fibers or motor fibers. We can classify the sensory fibers from the muscle into type A, type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. For type 1A, it's called primary spindle ending, and for type 2, it's called secondary spindle ending. They are different in diameter and myelination. We can fibers may be classified as A, B, and C, and can be classified the sensory fibers as 1A, 1B, 2, 3, 4, and if we consider type 1A and 1B, they are corresponding to A alpha fibers. If we are talking about type 2, they are corresponding to A beta. Type 3 corresponding to A delta, and type 4 corresponding to dorsal root C fibers. We will start by talking about afferent fibers to muscle spindles. Afferent fibers, that means they transmit sensory information from the muscle spindle to the CNS. Here, the muscle spindle, if they are stretched, as you said, the muscle spindle has central area which is not contractile. It is the central receptor area. It detects stretch of the muscle, and whenever there is a stretch to the muscle, the spindle informs the spinal cord or informs the CNS about this stretch, and the information passes from this receptor to the CNS via two types of fibers, either group 1A fiber or group 2 fiber. Group 1A fiber or primary group 1A fiber innervate both nuclear bag and the nuclear chain fibers, but type 2 fiber receive information only from nuclear chain. We have central connections of afferent fibers after they here. This is the muscle spindle, and this is the afferent fiber or sensory fiber that may be type 1A or maybe 2 according to the type of the muscle spindle, either it is nuclear bag or nuclear chain. Then it has some central connection. The first one is a direct connection with the anterior horn cell of the stretched muscle, and through this connection the reflex arc is completed. The second connection to spinocerebellar tract, it passes to the cerebellum, to inform the cerebellum about the degree of stretch of the muscle or the position of the muscle. And the third connection was to the cerebral cortex. About the efferent fibers to the muscle spindle, again we have two types of cells in the anterior horn, one called alpha motor neuron and the other called gamma motor neuron. For alpha motor neuron, they innervate the fleshy part of the muscle or extrafusal muscle fiber. And for gamma motor neuron, which are smaller in size and present in less amount in the anterior horn cells, it represents 30%, about 30% of cells in the anterior horn. They innervate the peripheral contractile parts of the intrafusal muscle fibers. Can you see here? Yes, the peripheral part, the peripheral contractile part. So this fiber in violet are motor nerves or gamma motor neurons that come from the spinal cord and innervate the peripheral contractile part of the spinal cord. And for the red color fibers, it is the sensory fibers which supply the central receptor part of the muscle spindle. Efferent fibers from the spinal cord or gamma motor neurons are of two types. The first one, called the dynamic gamma efferent. Dynamic gamma efferent ends mainly on nuclear bag fibers. And the second is called static gamma efferent. It ends mainly on nuclear chain fibers. Plate ending or trail ending, it is just description to the shape of the ending of the fiber. So dynamic gamma fibers usually end as plate ending, while static fibers usually end as trail ending. This is trail ending and this is plate ending. So, to summarize, the innervations of the muscle spindle has afferent fibers, which are sensory fibers, innervate the central receptor area of the intrafusal muscle fiber, and efferent fibers, which are motor fibers or gamma motor neurons, which supply the peripheral contractile part of the muscle spindle. So, for sensory fibers, we have two types of sensory fibers, either primary nerve ending or secondary nerve ending. The primary nerve ending receives information from both nuclear bag and nuclear chain fibers, while secondary nerve ending receive information only from nuclear chain fibers. So this is type 1A and this is type 2 fibers. For efferent fibers or gamma motor neurons, it is further subdivided into two subdivisions. The first is dynamic gamma efferent. It supplies nuclear bag mainly. And the static gamma motor neurons, it supplies nuclear chain mainly. So again, this is nuclear bag fibers. This is nuclear chain fibers. As you can see, nuclear bag is larger. And here, this is the central receptor area of the muscle, of the intrafusal muscle fiber, and this is the peripheral contractile area of the intrafusal muscle fiber. This is nuclear bag fiber, and this is nuclear chain fiber. So the presence of central dilatation, what determine is nuclear bag or nuclear chain fiber. This fiber in red is gamma motor neuron to the peripheral contractile part of intrafusal muscle fiber, while the blue, this blue fiber is sensory afferent, which transmits the information of stretch from the intrafusal muscle fiber to the central nervous system. Practically, we have two types of stretch reflex. So stretch reflex, as a stretch reflex, it has the same concept. Stretch of the innervated muscle result in reflex contraction. That is the stretch reflex. But we have two types or two forms of stretch reflex. one called dynamic stretch reflex and the other is static stretch reflex. For dynamic stretch reflex, it occurs while muscle length actually increasing, but static stretch reflex occurs throughout the period of steady stretch. Dynamic stretch reflex due to stretch of dynamic nuclear back fibers, while static stretch reflex is due to stretch of static back fibers and nuclear chain fibers. So you have to know that we have two types of nuclear back fibers, one called dynamic nuclear back fibers and the other called static nuclear back fibers. In dynamic stretch reflex, there is increased rate of discharge from primary ending, but for static stretch reflex, there is increased rate of discharge from both primary and secondary endings. To summarize, stretch reflex is deep monosynaptic monosynaptic spinal reflex. So it is deep reflex in the terms that its receptor, which are muscle spindles, are present deeply within the muscle. They are not present in superficial area like the skin. Monosynaptic means it has single synapse between afferent and efferent fibers. And spinal because it is processed and its center present in the spinal cord. Change the muscle length by stretch occurs in dynamic phase and static phase. Muscle spindles, which consist of connective tissue capsule, fusiform connective tissue capsule, surrounding intrafusal muscle fibers, which are innervated by afferent and efferent innervations, is the receptor of stretch reflex. We have two main types of intrafusal muscle fibers, which are nuclear bag and nuclear chain fibers. We have two types of afferent fibers, two intrafusal muscle fibers, which are primary and secondary nerve ending. We have two types of efferent fibers, two intrafusal fibers, which are dynamic and static gamma efferent fibers. And we have two types of stretch reflex, which are dynamic and static stretch reflex according to the pattern of stretch. If it is sudden stretch, it is dynamic stretch reflex, but if stretch is sustained stretch, so it is static stretch reflex. So sudden stretch provoke dynamic stretch reflex, while sustained stretch provoke or evokes static stretch reflex. Thank you for your attention. So this is the end of our introduction about stretch reflex and the motor nervous system. Thank you.